Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I'm gonna make this video possibly a little bit shorter if I can, if at all possible. But for those of you, of course, that did not end up seeing my video earlier in the week, I was doing five predictions on UFC 287. And I believe I had only predicted that of the two main events, at least on my YouTube channel. So I'm really only going to be talking about those main two fights. And at first, I'm only going to be talking about Israel Adesanya versus that of Alex Pereira. And then later on in the video, I'm also going to be talking about Jorge Masvidal versus Gilbert Burns as well, for those of you that still want to stick around and watch that part of the video. But anyways, for those of you that did not end up seeing the results of UFC 287, Israel Adesanya was not just able to beat Alex Pereira in the rematch, but he was also able to stop him, as you can so clearly see here, unless you have a hard time seeing the picture. But anyways, Israel Adesanya, I had actually predicted him to lose the match, and I believe that with my fight predictions, at least when you talk about the two main events, which are really the only two fights that I predicted, mainly because I really didn't really get into as much depth in terms of the other two fights. I believe that I predicted Alex Pereira, at least finally, in my final prediction, I think, to win it by that of decision, either split decision or unanimous decision. And you can argue that in this fight before the stoppage that Alex Pereira was actually winning the fight. I thought that his leg kicks, I thought that he landed more leg kicks in that of the first round than that of Israel Adesanya. You maybe could debate that Israel Adesanya was winning that round, debatably, but it was very, very close. Neither fighter really did a great amount in that first round. And then, of course, the second round, it was going a little bit back and forth. I thought that Alex, I can't really remember who was winning the first part of it. Izzy may have been, but Alex started getting him. There was a few leg kicks that ended up hurting Israel Adesanya's legs very badly because Alex Pereira was getting some very good leg kicks in there. He was getting some very good, I believe, low leg kicks, or at least leg kicks to the knee area around there. And it was hurting Israel Adesanya. And to be honest with you, right when the stoppage happened, it actually looked like Israel Adesanya was about to get stopped again. His leg looked very hurt, at least when you talk about the right leg. He was up against the cage. It did not look like he was able to move in a very great position. But Israel Adesanya, and this is an issue that Alex Pereira has as well to a degree as what Israel Adesanya has. Alex Pereira, with the way that he fights, even though he's a very accurate striker and he's very dangerous, a lot of the times, like I said, his head does not move. And an even bigger problem when he was there, because really Alex Pereira should have won this fight. He really should have won by stoppage potentially in that second round, or potentially won it in the third or the fourth round. But because his hands were so low when it came down to it, and on top of that, he was not paying attention to an incoming counter, and his head a lot of the times does not move off center. It was very easy for Israel Adesanya to counter him. And Israel Adesanya does have enough power to pretty much knock anyone out in that weight division, even an Alex Pereira, who very clearly is probably the biggest guy in that weight division. So Alex Pereira, once again, he probably should have been the victor in this fight had he played it a little bit more intelligently. But Alex Pereira, he's not a guy that I've ever really took a look at him and I ever thought that he was the most intelligent fighter. I wouldn't say that he's necessarily an unintelligent fighter, necessarily. Of course, he was a champion, and he ended up being that of Israel Adesanya. But I would label him as a quote-unquote bully fighter. And there are just certain fighters that are like that. What Alex Pereira is, he's almost like the Deontay Wilder of MMA. Extraordinary power, but he does have a lot of flaws in his style. A lot of the times he can utilize that reach and he can utilize that striking. And because he has that one punch, type of knockout power, a lot of the times he can get away with it. But when he gets in the ring finally with that elite guy, he may be able to beat him. He may not be able to beat him. Now, of course, in that first fight, he was able to beat Izzy. But I also thought that he was losing that match. This match, I actually thought that he was winning. But once Israel Adesanya knocked out that of Alex Pereira, I'm not really quite sure if Alex Pereira is going to be able to win that trilogy. But we'll see it. We'll see what happens about that. And excuse me, in my view, more than likely, there probably is going to be a trilogy. But, I predicted Alex Pereira to win the match. The reason why I thought that was because, A, I didn't know where Izzy Adesanya's head was going to be, because I knew that 3-0 mark that Pereira had over him, of course, 2 in kickboxing and 1 in the UFC, I knew more than likely it was going to have a little bit of a mental hold over that of Israel Adesanya. And on top of that, I didn't really know what type of adjustments he was going to make. But to be fair to Israel Adesanya, I will say this: he did make one adjustment that I said he was going to need to make, which was get out of range or at least get off the cage when Alex Pieta tries to bully you. Now, of course, he was on the cage when Alex Pieta was, actually lighting him up against the cage and starting to hurt him very badly in that second round. But Israel Adesanya, once again, he was able to get the knockout because Alex Pieta was not covering up whatsoever. He was not covering up whatsoever. His hands were by his hips when it came down to it. And if Alex Pieta plans to win the rematch against Israel Adesanya or the trilogy, the rubber match, he can possibly do it. But what he's going to have to do is that he's going to have to really work on his defense. His hands are going to have to be up higher. He's going to have to move in and outside of the range a little bit better. He's going to have to utilize his feet a little bit better. Because to be honest with you, I thought that he was potentially winning this rematch, but he just had certain flaws that also got exposed in this fight. And that's why this fight really was so potentially great, because both fighters have certain advantages over the other, but they also have certain weaknesses that the other one could exploit. And I will say this once again: Israel Adesanya did a great job of moving off the cage when he needed to. Now, of course, that last minute when he actually ended up getting the stoppage, he didn't move off the cage very well, but that was because his leg was pretty much toast. And for those of you that did not end up seeing the fight, Alex Pieta, he actually landed a great amount of leg kicks. He landed a great amount of leg kicks to Israel Adesanya, and he was very badly hurt with the leg kick. He had limped, I believe, a couple times, or you could tell that he had to put some weight off it and that he had to go in the southpaw position because that right leg looked very hurt. At least I believe that it was the right leg. So Alex Pieta, in my opinion, he actually was going about things decently correctly. I think that the leg kicks, I think that that was a good strategy. He was utilizing his feet a little bit better, but his main Achilles heel showed up, which is not moving his head off the center line and also not keeping his hands up, which also is a little bit of an issue with Israel Adesanya, which also showed its ugly head a little bit in this fight, because there were certain hand strikes that he ended up getting caught with in this fight as well. But now that Israel Adesanya ended up getting the knockout in this fight, the big question is, will Alex Pieta be able to beat that of Israel Adesanya in a trilogy match? And I'm just not quite so sure about that. Now, UFC, ends up a lot different than that of boxing. In UFC, you never truly know what is going to end up happening. There are certain times where a fighter has won all three fights, like that, I believe, of, Alexander Volkanovski against Max Holloway, or other fights. There's been times where, it's been 1-1, or there's been times where it's been 1-2-1. You just never truly know what's going to end up happening in a fight. For example, for those of you that remember Brandon Moreno versus that of Davison Figueiredo, in the first fight, I believe it was a draw. In the second fight, I believe Brandon Moreno ended up pulling it out. In the third fight, Davison Figueiredo ended up pulling it out, where I thought that Brandon Moreno more than likely was going to dominate him. And then, of course, in the fourth match, Davison Figueiredo ended up, losing to that of Brandon Moreno. Brandon Moreno, of course, ended up dominating him, and I believe even stopping him in that match. So you just never truly know what's going to happen in a UFC fight, because there's just so many different factors. You're not just dealing with hand striking there. You're also dealing with leg kicks. You're also dealing with grappling and the clinch. And you never really can tell what is mainly going to be a factor. Because a lot of the times in boxing, you can predict it, at least in my view, a little bit more easily, because, you're pretty much only using the hands. And on top of that, you can tell what someone's mental state is going to be. At least I personally can, usually. And that's why I usually have a great accuracy record in terms of predicting boxing. And I still have a decent record in terms of predicting in that of UFC. But UFC, in my view anyway, has always been a little bit difficult to pinpoint, at least a little bit more difficult to pinpoint, because there's just so many factors. Because if a person is uncomfortable in a certain area, they can always rely on something else, such as leg kicks, or such as grappling, or such as a clinch, that opponent may not be able to deal with. So if they cannot deal with their striking whatsoever, they might be able to resort to grappling and be completely safe for that fight. And something in boxing, that's not necessarily something that you can do. You're going to have to fight with that fighter sometimes with your hands, whether you like it or not. It just is what it is. In UFC, that's not always necessarily the case. Now, you're still probably going to have to somewhat be okay with your hands, or, or in the grappling department. But once again, there are certain fighters to where, depending on the factors, to where that's not always the case. But Israel Adesanya and Alex Pieta, of course, they're both known strikers. And I knew that Izzy was going to be the more technical fighter out of the two. But once again, I did not really know where his mental state was going to be. But once again, congratulations to Israel Adesanya. I did predict Alex Pieta to win the rematch. But once again, it's going to be very interesting to see what Israel Adesanya and Alex Pereira, what they're able to do in this rubber match. And that's really the bigger question, is really about the third match. Who's really going to be able to win that fight? Because Alex Pereira has certain things that really can expose certain flaws in Israel Adesanya's game. And Israel Adesanya really has certain things that are able to expose some of Alex Pereira's flaws. And what flaws am I necessarily talking about? Well, Israel Adesanya, he is a very good counterpuncher. He's a very good technical fighter. And Alex Pereira, he's not someone that utilizes his feet to the best of his ability. He doesn't move in and outside of range, always to the greatest of degrees. He's a very plodding and straightforward fighter. He's also a guy that does not move his head off, angles very well. And on top of that, a lot of the times when he has his opponents in trouble, he keeps his hands down. And that's exactly what ended up getting him tossed in this fight, because he probably would have won the fight again by knockout had he kept his hands up. And if Alex Pereira can keep his hands up and also have the same degree of confidence that he did in the prior two fights, then I may predict Alex Pereira to win the trilogy. But the biggest question is this, because Alex Pereira, what I'll say about him is this: he is a bully fighter. And certain fighters that have a style of a bully fighter, someone that likes to plod forward to break their opponents down, relies a lot on that size, relies a lot on that level of power. Once they end up getting stopped or once they end up getting beaten, sometimes they're never the same again. Now, once again, in UFC, it's a little bit different. But right now, if I had to predict who is going to win the rubber match, I would probably have to predict that of Israel Adesanya. Because now that Israel Adesanya has now that Israel Adesanya has figured out that he can knock that of Alex Pereira out, now that he's figured out that, he can knock him out with good, just one punch, even when he's in trouble, that might ruin the confidence and also kind of the facade that Alex Pereira is going to have, which is that even if you hit me with a good shot, or even if you hurt me, even if I'm down all rounds, I can basically come in there whenever I want and I can knock you out with one shot. And he still can do that, but it's not going to be as intimidating as it was before. And this was a very big fight for Alex Pereira, especially because he was not the more technical fighter than Israel Adesanya. He was not the more technical fighter. So once again, that third match is going to be very interesting, especially to see where both of them are mentally and what adjustments they make. But the main adjustment that I liked to see out of Israel Adesanya in this fight, or that I think that I saw that, in my view was the best improvement that he made, was moving off the cage when he needed to. That was a very big problem with him in the first fight, because I think he thought that Alex Pereira, that he was not going to be able to hit him as much as what he thought. He thought wrong, and of course he ended up getting stopped and knocked out in that of the fifth and final round. Well, in this fight, at least he tried to get certain angles, and he tried to move off the cage whenever he could and occupy the vacated space. But even with that, in my view, he got hit with way too many leg kicks. And I think Israel Adesanya, that he's going to have to work on that. And a lot of the times, I don't think he's used to it, because he can usually escape certain strikes because he usually has a reach advantage over most fighters. Well, Alex Pereira is a guy that is going to be able to compete with Israel Adesanya in that physical dimension with his height and reach every single time. And on top of that, Pereira is even more powerful in terms of his striking ability than what Israel Adesanya is. So once again, it's going to be very interesting to see how that trilogy match goes. But if Israel Adesanya wants to win the rematch, he's going to have to commit to his strikes a little bit more, keep going with the leg kicks, and also learn how to avoid those leg kicks. Because to be quite honest with you, Pereira, in my view, had a very good game plan, but he really just fucked it up for himself in this fight. Just my personal view of it. Alex Pereira, what he's going to have to do in the rematch is that he's going to have to keep his hands up. He's going to have to be a little bit less sloppy. And on top of that, once again, move your head out of the center line. Move your head a little bit more. You need to. But other than that, in my view, utilize the jab, go to the legs, like you did. Utilize the right hand, utilize the left. It hit Israel Adesanya a multitude of times. In my view, he was debatably winning the fight before the fight ended up getting stopped, of course, in that the second round. But once again, that third match, hopefully it happens, at least I'm hoping for it. That's going to be a very particularly interesting fight. A very particularly interesting fight, because once again, there's still certain things that I think Izzy needs to work on. I don't know if he really has Alex completely figured out yet. But that level of confidence was a great confidence booster, because now Israel Adesanya figured out that, even if this guy does potentially hurt me, I can possibly hurt him right back. So Alex Pereira, he's going to have to be very careful if he is potentially going to win the third fight against that of Israel Adesanya in the rubber match. And another thing is this: some of these bully fighters, once again, that have this facade of, well, I can usually take any shot and I can usually walk down any fighter, and, pretty much eventually everything's going to go my way because I can eventually stop these guys, whether I'm winning the fight or not. A lot of the times, once they get stopped and once they get beat, their level of confidence is never the same again. So once again, that's going to be very interesting to see if Alex Pereira, how he mentally gets past this, if he handles it well, or if he doesn't handle it well. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens. That's also going to be another question that I have. But UFC is usually a little bit different than that of boxing. Usually UFC fighters recover a little bit better than that of boxers. So we'll see what ends up happening. But it's going to be very particularly interesting. But congratulations to Israel Adesanya. I think the reason why he beat Alex Pereira was really mainly because Alex Pereira's Achilles heel, which is that of keeping his hands down a lot of the times, his chin being straight up in the air. Actually, a lot of the times like Israel Adesanya. And on top of that, not moving his head off the center line, which is all things that I mentioned about Alex Pereira, and it ended up costing him in this fight. A fight that, to be honest with you, he probably should have won because he was winning that second round in my view, but it is what it is. Stuff happens. Hopefully he can use that as a learning experience. As for Israel Adesanya, I think that he needs to move off the cage just as well as what he did in some of the moments in this fight in the rematch. He also needs to use that lead hand. He also needs to sit down on his punches a little bit more. In my view, it was very clear that he was a little bit afraid of the counters that were going to be incoming by that of Alex Pereira, and that's understandable. He has a very quick and a very devastating, even on the inside counter left hook, that is very quick. So he has to be very, very careful with Mr. Alex Pereira. But there is going to be some times to where you are going to have to mix up your strikes, to the legs and also to the head, which he was doing. But he's going to have to be a little bit more active, in my opinion, in that third fight. He's going to have to show Alex Pereira even more than what he did in the first fight, a little bit more of who's boss. He has to be more active than him. Because Alex Pereira, he's going to be a guy that you have to try to keep him back. You have to try to let him know, keep him honest. Say, no, you're not going to bully me around. I have power too, and I ended up knocking you out within the second fight, within that of the UFC. You better stay back or you're going to get in trouble. And if you can do that, you might be able to completely outbox him, or you might be able to completely drag him to a decision or stop him again. Once again, it depends on the adjustments and the confidence level that Alex Pereira is going to have in a third fight. So that's going to be a very interesting fight. But anyway, that's pretty much about it for that little analyzation. Now time to move on to the Gilbert Burns versus Jorge Masvidal fight. I did end up getting that fight prediction correctly. Gilbert Burns did end up winning that of unanimous decision. Now, it was a decently close fight. I believe that the fight was 2-1. At least that's the way that I scored it. I think I gave the first round to Jorge Masvidal. If you gave it to Gilbert Burns, I didn't necessarily mind it. But I just think Gilbert Burns did not do enough in the first round. Second round, he went more for the takedowns, which is what I said he was going to have to do. And out of the third round, he was able to outstrike Masvidal a little bit. But Gilbert Burns, in my view, really, if he wanted to win this fight more dominantly, but I do think that his end game, or that his goal, was to strike Masvidal a little bit because of what Masvidal said about him, mainly being a quote-unquote crotch sniffer and that of a wrestler. I think he wanted to prove a point, and he's got to be careful because there's some times where fighters, especially, they try to prove a point, and a lot of the times it doesn't play to their strengths, and they let someone get in their head, and they end up losing a fight because of it, kind of like Ronda Rousey against Holly Holm. You don't try to compete with someone in their best category, especially if that's one of your weaker categories. But Gilbert Burns, of course, he's not a weak striker necessarily. He's just a guy that, in terms of his boxing ability, he's not the greatest. Now, he doesn't have bad striking necessarily. He has a decent jab, and, he's got a good overhand right and a good left hook, but the problem with Gilbert Burns is that a lot of his strikes, that they're just very looping and very wide and very advertised. And that's why, against Kamaru Usman and against someone that can punch straight, he's going to have a little bit more of a problem with them because straight punches always beat looping punches. It just is what it is. That's something that you learn in boxing very early on. And Masvidal, he knows how to box a little bit. I'm not saying that he's a professional boxer, of course, by any means, but for a UFC fighter, for an MMA fighter, he knows how to utilize his jab. He knows how to, put that right hand straight down the pipe. He knows how to, beat certain looping punches. He knows how to punch straight down the pipe. He has decent striking ability. And if Gilbert Burns was going to try to strike at him in the middle of the ring, more than likely that was not going to work. So he needed to utilize the takedowns and also that of the clinch and the grappling really to win this fight, which is eventually what he did in the second round. And then, of course, in the third round, he found a little bit of his flow with that of the striking. So Gilbert Burns did end up winning that fight, just like I had predicted. I think that, he probably could have won all 3 rounds had he utilized that of the grappling and the clinch a little bit more. Because once again, Gilbert does need to work on his striking. Gilbert, don't get me wrong, once again, he is not a bad striker per se, but he is always going to have problems against guys that can box a little bit, because once again, a lot of the times he throws these brawling and advertised and these looping punches. And that can work against guys that are a little bit less experienced or are not the best of strikers. But it's not going to work against guys that know how to punch straight down the pipe and are accurate and confident within their striking ability. So he's going to have to be very careful with that, because that's lost him a couple fights in my view, including the Kamaru Usman and Khamzat Chimaev fights. So he's got to be very careful. We'll see what ends up happening with that. But Jorge Masvidal, of course, for those of you that did not end up hearing the news, and I pretty much was correct on this, Masvidal ended up retiring after the fight, which is pretty much what I predicted. Like I said, the way that he was talking, I don't think Masvidal really ever thought that he was actually going to win this fight. I think he thought that there was a slim chance that maybe if he could con Gilbert Burns into just striking with him, which I think that's kind of what his goal was, that maybe he could win the fight. But I think he knew more than likely that he was going to lose the fight, and that's why he was mainly talking about retirement. And Jorge Masvidal said something of a sort to where, sometimes your favorite basketball player, he just no longer has that jump shot, or your favorite football player, he can no longer throw it far down the field. Basically, of course, alluding that he no longer has it because of old age. And he is 38 years old. And in my view, it is a very good time for Jorge Masvidal to retire, especially if he is to keep that image of being, formerly one of the top fighters in the UFC. But in my view, this is just my personal view, I don't think Jorge Masvidal really lost the fight because of his quote-unquote old age. And some people may disagree with this. They'll say, what are you talking about? The man is 38 years old. Yes, and there are certain fighters to where they get around that range, and you can clearly tell they're not the same fighter. But Jorge Masvidal, I don't really see anything different with his style. I just think that he finally was fighting repeated top contenders when the division finally ended up getting very talented. And I think that he pretty much ended up getting exposed for the fighter that he never was. And don't get me wrong, Masvidal was always a very good fighter. He was just never a great one. And I said that about him a very long time ago. I predicted for Usman to beat him. I predicted Colby Covington to beat him. I predicted Gilbert Burns to beat him. And I'm not quite sure if he would beat Leon Edwards. And I'm quite positive he would not beat Khamzat Chimaev. And once again, right even before his transformation as a little bit of a new fighter, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson put a beating on him. Jorge Masvidal, once again, very good fighter, especially with the striking ability. He's also not a bad grappler. But Jorge Masvidal is an example of a fighter that he's an all-around good fighter in every category, but he does nothing exceptional. And there's just certain fighters that are like that. There are certain fighters to where they're very good all around, and, they're very decent fighters, or they're very decent athletes, but there's just nothing about them that is exceptional. And that's Jorge Masvidal. He's very good in most categories, but is he a striker of, say, like a prime Conor McGregor, in my opinion, at least as devastating as what he was? Now, there might be certain flaws that Conor has in his style that maybe Jorge does not have, like keeping his chin way up too high and keeping his hands down a little bit more. But Conor had that level of power. He also had that level of boxing ability and counters, at least in his prime. Is he a John Jones level striker? Is he someone like a Volkanovski? Is he on the level of those guys? No, there's just nothing that he does really that is that exceptional. And unfortunately for him, he is in a weight division to where a lot of that really isn't going to matter as much anyway, because you have 2 guys, really 3 guys there now. You might even be able to debate a little bit more. People like Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington that have A-grade wrestling ability to where it almost doesn't matter how great your striking is. If you're not able to compete with their wrestling, you're not going to be able to beat them. So it just is what it is, unfortunately, for Masvidal. But Masvidal, once again, had a very good career. I just don't think that he was ever a great fighter. I don't think, personally, just my view of it, I don't think he really lost the fight because of old age. I think that this is just the fighter that he always personally was. It is what it is. And that's the reason why he's 35-17 in his career. But it is what it is. But anyways, great on both fighters. Very good fight by Gilbert Burns and Jorge Masvidal. Also a very good little short fight by that of Alex Pereira and that of Israel Adesanya. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. That's my fight analyzations. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later.